Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I'm glad that you're with me today, and I pray that this episode will be a blessing to you. And I'm actually doing something pretty different for me today. And that is that I'm just recording this episode kind of very spontaneously. I don't even have any notes in front of me or anything, but just something that's been on my heart and in my mind that I've kind of been thinking about. And I don't know why, I just feel like I want to talk about it, so I'm going to give this a try. But anyway, I'm actually at my cabin at the moment, so if the audio sounds a little bit different, I'm just doing this episode very spontaneously. I'm not in my studio at home, so it might even sound a little bit different. I'm not sure. But let me start with this metaphor. Imagine that there are two sisters, and for whatever reason, one of them loves to play ping pong, and it so happens they have a ping pong table, and this one sister absolutely loves ping pong. The other sister, ping pong's okay, but I'm not that crazy about it. I could kind of take it or leave it. So one sister is much more motivated. She has a higher desire for ping pong. The other sister has a lower desire. So in a very real sense, a principle emerges that we see and learn, which is the person with the lower desire essentially automatically assumes control over how often we're going to play ping pong, because the sister that loves ping pong and would like to play ping pong a whole bunch, a whole lot, she loves it, she would say yes to ping pong virtually any time she has the opportunity. She would automatically say yes. So it's the lower desire sister who assumes control of the frequency of the game of ping pong, because the higher desire sister would say yes all the time. So how often they play is going to be based upon when and if the lower desire sister says, okay, I guess I'll go ahead and play. So the regularity of the ping pong game between the sisters is going to be predicated upon how often the lower desire sister says that she would like to play the game. And I'm pretty sure that you can see where I'm going with this as a metaphor of what happens in the sexual relationship within the context of marriage between a husband and his wife. Inevitably, the lower desire partner has the most power over the sexual relationship in the marriage, and they have this position of power over the frequency of how often sex is going to happen in the context of the marriage. And we know, guys, by the way, that either partner can be higher sexed, right? Sometimes the wife is the higher sexed partner and would like sex more than her husband. But I would advocate that more often than not, it's the husband who wants sex more than his wife. In fact, I recently read a statistic that said that 75% of the time the husband wants sex more than his wife, and 25% of the time the wife wants sex more than her husband. And between you and I'm a little bit suspect of that statistic, because I would suspect that the husband wants sex more than 75% of the time. But be that as it may, the point is well taken that more often than not, typically the male, the husband, the man wants sex more than his wife. And therefore, he is the higher sexed partner and the wife is the lower sexed partner. And therefore, in most situations, in most marriages, I would advocate that the wife becomes the one who controls what's happening in the sexual relationship in the marriage, because she's the lower sexed partner. And just like the game of ping pong, the higher sexed partner would say yes virtually any time he got the chance to play the game. He'd say, yes, I want to have sex with my wife. I'd like to have sex more often. He'd take it as much as he could get it. So the regularity or the frequency of how often sex happens in the marriage is predicated upon the low sexed partner, because they essentially have the power to say when and if they want to do it, when and if they're willing to participate, and therefore they kind of automatically assume control because sex is going to happen only when and if they give the green light. So we learn this principle that almost automatically, spontaneously, the lower sexed partner is the one who assumes control of sexual frequency in the marriage. And maybe another little metaphor would be that of driving a car. When you drive a car, you have two main controls. One is the gas and one is the brakes. The gas makes the car go, right? And the brakes makes the car stop. So in this metaphor, most guys are the gas in their marriage relationship sexually. They want to push the gas. Let's go. Let's have forward progress. Let's make this happen. Let's do this more regular. Let's have more frequency. Let's have sex together. So the husband is the gas, and the wife or the lower sex partner becomes the brakes, because they're the one who has the power to hit the brakes and say, no, I don't want to go forward right now. So the point I'm getting to, you guys, is this. Whether it's the husband or the wife who's the higher sex partner, you'll notice that I just chose to title this kind of spontaneous episode, Surrendering the Higher Ground, because what I'm advocating for here is that if a marriage is going to be healthy, if a couple is going to be healthy within the context of their marriage, if the sexual relationship is going to be healthy, I just think it's incredibly important that not one person has the control over the sexual relationship, that there's a kind of mutuality in the marriage, and there are two people, and there are two opinions, and there are two voices, and that the couple is working together to kind of determine together the sexual frequency and the sexual rhythm of their marriage together. Or said another way, I might suggest, I just personally believe that it's wrong, and I think I can support it biblically, that it's wrong when one person becomes what would be called the gatekeeper of sex. And therefore, sex can only happen when and if the gatekeeper says that it can happen. And I'm saying that if the marriage is going to be healthier, I think it's important that two people, both people, have a voice and have an opinion, and that both people are working together in order to find a sexual rhythm, a sexual frequency that works for them in a healthy way within the context of their marriage. And by the way, this is the importance of this concept that I call the sexual alliance. I did a series of episodes earlier in the podcast entitled The Sexual Alliance, and this is kind of the concept that I was talking about, that it's important for a married couple to forge this sexual alliance where they're working together. The right hand knows what the left hand's thinking, the left hand knows what the right hand's thinking and feeling, and there's a working cooperation, a mutuality, a mutual respect, and that this couple is trying to find a sexual rhythm that works for them. But this concept of the sexual alliance assumes something, and that is that it assumes that both people have a voice, both people have an opinion, and that both people are willing to listen to each other and hear one another and work together on this situation. But I called this episode Surrendering the Higher Ground because what is occurring to me is this concept of the sexual alliance really puts an onus on the lower sexed person in the relationship, and really, I think, is going to be much harder for them to contemplate and consider the concept of the sexual alliance, because they already automatically, almost by default, have control over the sexual relationship in the marriage, because they're the lower sexed person, right? The game of ping pong only is going to happen as often as that person says, I want to play the game of ping pong. So the lower sex person gets this control almost by default. So by suggesting this idea of the sexual alliance, I think it puts an onus on the lower sex person. Or maybe here's another way to say it. I think it's going to take a really big person to consider the sexual alliance if they're the lower sex partner, because they already have control of what's happening in the sexual relationship in the marriage. And most people, I think, intuitively like to have a sense of control in their life, right? Most of us want control. Who wants to be out of control? It's like if I'm driving down the highway 70 miles an hour and all of a sudden the steering wheel came off in my hands, detached from the car, I'd have this horrible sense of panic and upset, right? Because now suddenly I don't have control. So Tony, you're asking me to surrender the control that I have in this part of my life. It's like I have control. The lower sex partner might feel this way. I have control of sex in my marriage. I have control of how often it happens. I'm the gatekeeper. And because I'm the lower sex person, this can only happen when and if I say it happens. You see, because the higher sex partner is basically going to say yes all the time, right? They're going to take whatever they can get. So this means the lower sexed person has that power. So I just think it's really going to take a big person in order to move toward the sexual alliance, because in a sense, they are agreeing to surrender the control that they have over the sexual frequency, the sexual regularity, the sexual rhythm that's happening in the marriage. And they're willing to hear their partner, give place to their partner, and basically surrender some of the power that they've been holding over to their partner. So now their partner has more voice. Their partner has more power in the sexual aspect of the marriage. And I think it's going to take a really big person to be willing to do that, to say, hey, I see and understand that I don't have to have all the power. I'm not sure that it's fair that sex can only happen when and if I say that sex can happen. And I see that for us to be healthy together, it's going to require that we have this working cooperation and we both have a voice. So here's another metaphor that I was thinking, you guys. It's like if you are the commanding officer of a platoon of men, military, and you're confronting the enemy and there's going to be this battle, this skirmish. So you find yourself facing the enemy in this field of battle. Well, a principle of battle is that if you have the opportunity to hold the high ground, it gives you a distinct advantage on the field of battle. Because when you're holding the higher ground, you can see what's going on below you. And the enemy who has the lower ground can't really see as good because they're fighting uphill. They can't really see over the top. They don't know what's going on. So you have this distinct advantage because you're holding the higher ground, and it gives you, therefore, a power. You can see better. You're able to fight better. And in a sense, I think the lower sexed partner in the marriage relationship is holding the higher ground because they have this strategic advantage. They have more power over their spouse because they have control of how often sex can happen in the marriage. So imagine if we were asking this commanding officer to surrender the higher ground that he holds, the power that he holds, the advantage that he holds over the enemy. We don't want you to fight from the position of higher ground anymore. See, that gives you an unfair advantage in the battle. So we're asking you to come down on the same level as your enemy and fight the battle on that same level. And I think that this is counterintuitive, right? It's counterintuitive to the nature of a human being. I want the advantage. I want the power. I want the control. And that's what I would prefer in this position of battle. So you're asking me to surrender the higher ground? See, that's the title of this episode, Surrendering the Higher Ground. And really, this episode is geared primarily toward the lower sexed person in the relationship, because they are the one that's going to have to surrender this position of power. They're going to have to surrender the power they have to be the gatekeeper. And they're going to have to surrender some of the power that they have to say no to how often sex can happen in the relationship if they're going to defer to their spouse in any way. So that now both people have a voice, both people have an opinion, there's more of a mutuality, which makes the sexual alliance a possibility now. Because it's not just about me controlling what's happening, but it's about us controlling what's happening together. We both have a voice in this thing. And I would suggest that the sexual health in a marriage, I think, really is predicated upon the opinion of both persons, or at least it should be, right? There's two people in the marriage. There's two sets of feelings, 2 points of view, 2 ways of looking at things, 2 different sexual desires. And so the regularity of what happens is going to have to be kind of worked out between these 2 parties if things are going to be healthy. And therefore, I just really was thinking about this, and I think in a way it makes it really hard for the lower sexed person, because they've already got control. They've already got the position of higher ground. And therefore, it's going to take a big person. You're being called upon to do something that's counterintuitive to human nature, to surrender the control that you've been holding in your marriage over sex, over your spouse, because they'd like to play ping pong more often than you. And so if you're going to give place to them, if you're going to consider them, if you're going to allow them to have more of a voice in your marriage, then you're going to have to consider the possibility of you saying yes to the game of ping pong a little bit more than you've been accustomed to saying yes. And of course, what I'm not saying here is that any person should ever have sex against their will or in violation of their own conscience. I'm not suggesting that the lower sex person should be coerced or forced into having more sex than they want to have. I don't think that's what it's about. But it's about working with your partner and forging this alliance and having this working cooperation so that one person isn't in control, holding all the power, all the control, and that they become the gatekeeper. So now they have like this unfair advantage of the higher ground. So I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, and I guess I'm appealing for mutuality and respect and consideration of one another. And I'm just acknowledging that it's going to be harder for the lower sex person than it is the higher sex person. Because given the choice, of course, the higher sex person would say, yes, I want to play ping pong. Let's do this more. So it's no skin off their back, right? Because they want to play the game anyway. The challenge, therefore, is going to be geared more toward the lower sexed person who, in a sense, is going to have to stretch their comfort zone if they're going to move toward their partner, and they're going to have to be willing to play ping pong a little bit more than they even would really like to. But since they love their spouse and they know their spouse loves ping pong, and would really like to play more often than we typically play, then okay, I see that, since we're married and we love each other, we respect each other, we care for one another, that I see that it's kind of, in a way, unfair if only I get to say when and if we play ping pong. So I'm going to try to move toward you. I'm going to consider the possibility of trying to play ping pong more than I'm used to so that we can have a little more mutuality, a little more balance here. And guys, if I had to pick a proof text for this episode, this concept of what I'm talking about, I would pick Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21. I've talked about this scripture before. I believe it's the most significant verse in the Bible when it comes to marriage. And in fact, it introduces this passage in Ephesians chapter 5, which I believe is the most extensive passage in the New Testament about marriage, where Paul is speaking to husbands and how husbands should love their wives, and speaking to wives and how wives should respect their husbands. And so he introduces the passage in Ephesians 5, verse 21. And I've said before that it's just 9 words, but it's unbelievably powerful. It's like spiritual dynamite, because dynamite is very small. It's a small package, but it holds a tremendous amount of power if it can be unleashed. And these 9 words, if a married couple would look at these 9 words and consider these 9 words, pray about these 9 words, embrace these 9 words, and then try to put into practice these 9 words, I believe that it could make a radical difference to any marriage, regardless of the difficulties or how troubled that marriage happens to be. And the 9 words are this: Ephesians 5, verse 21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And I'll read it one more time, Ephesians 5:21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And I think these are just beautiful words. And we should notice, by the way, that there's 3 personalities in view in this scripture. There's the husband, Mr. Jones, there's the wife, Mrs. Jones, and then there's Jesus himself, because all 3 parties are referenced. It says submit to one another. That is, Mr. Jones, you submit to Mrs. Jones, and Mrs. Jones, you submit to Mr. Jones. There is this idea of mutual submission, mutual respect, mutual love, mutual consideration. You see, this means that it isn't just about me anymore. It's not just about what I prefer, my preferences, what I see, what I think, what I feel, what I want, what I think we should do. This is about me. No, it says submit to one another. In other words, give regard to the other person. Consider who they are. Consider what they think, what they feel, what they want, what they need, what they would prefer, how they think we should do it. And so it says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And I think that's just beautiful, and I think it's incredibly important. I think it's interesting to note that it doesn't say submit to one another out of reverence for one another. In other words, I'm to submit to my wife, not just because I love and respect my wife, but because I love and respect Christ, and because I reverence Christ, and because Jesus is the Lord of my life, and because I'm seeking to move my heart, my life, and even my sexuality into the kingdom of God. So out of this reverence for Christ, it says I should submit to my wife, and vice versa, the wife should submit to her husband. And I'm sure you guys have seen this metaphor before, where there's a triangle, and of course the base of the triangle is wider than the top, right? Because it's like a pyramid. Both sides escalate up and come to the point in the middle, up at the top. And so in this metaphor, we put Christ at the very top, the pinnacle of the triangle. The triangle represents marriage. And on the lower left corner, we put the husband. On the lower right corner, we put the wife. And the principle is that as both partners move toward Christ, they're going up the sides of the pyramid. As both partners are moving closer to Christ, at the very same time, they're also moving closer to one another. And we learn, therefore, that God never intended for marriage just to be a two-way street, husband and wife. He intended marriage to be a three-way street, husband, wife, and Christ. And when we bring God into the equation, it changes everything. And it changes the way that we're going to do our marriage. And the primary way that it changes that is because it invites us into this place where we have a new and different respect and love and care for one another. Or in the verbiage of Ephesians 5:21, we submit to one another. There's a mutual submission. This is a kind of working cooperation. And I'm advocating that this is exactly what we're after with this concept of the sexual alliance, where both people have a voice, and we're going to try to find a sexual rhythm and a sexual regularity that's going to work for us within the context of our marriage and help us be healthier together. But again, in the way of just a quick review of what I've been talking about, I think that's going to require, in a sense, a high calling upon the lower sexed person because they've already got control of sexual regularity. So if they're going to try to respect their partner and submit to their partner, then they're going to have to consider the possibility of playing the game of ping pong a little bit more often than they've been used to because they're striving to submit to their partner out of reverence for Christ and vice versa. And with that being said, before I close this episode, I've just kind of been thinking out loud here. I do want to say one more time what I am not saying. I want to establish with absolute clarity that I am not suggesting that a person should be coerced or forced to have sex against their will or against their conscience. Tony, with this episode, are you saying that I'm forced, I should have sex with my spouse even if I don't want to? You're telling me I should have sex even if I don't want to have sex. And that's kind of abusive because you're saying that I should do this even if I don't want to do this. And that is not at all what I'm trying to say here. Of course, a person should never be coerced or forced to have sex against their will or against their conscience. And in view of that, if the higher sexed partner is going to apply Ephesians 5:21 and submit to their spouse, as the scripture says to do, then of course they would not have the heart to force their partner into sex, but they want their partner to have sex with them because they want to have sex with them. So I'm assuming that we have a context here of love and care and mutual respect and support and consideration and working cooperation. And I think that's exactly what Ephesians 5:21 is teaching us. So this thing is not suggested in the context of force or coercion or making somebody do something they don't want to do, but rather in a spirit of respect and working cooperation and mutual submission. And that if both partners in a marriage have that kind of heart and intention toward one another, I think it creates the possibility and the context for a really healthy marriage to become possible and for there to be growth and progress and health and blessing. So with that being said, you guys, I think the bottom line is just that if a couple's going to be healthy, they absolutely are going to have to work together on this thing and find a sexual rhythm and a sexual frequency, a sexual alliance with one another that's going to work for them and help them to be healthy together. And guys, before I finish up this episode, there is one other thought that I want to share with you that I think is really important, because I'm concerned about the person who's been listening to this who might be the lower sexed partner in their marriage, that they feel like I'm ganging up on them or beating them up or trying to make them do something maybe that they're not sure that they're ready or able or willing to do. And I just want to acknowledge that sometimes people are in a very hurt and broken and disoriented place for whatever reasons around their sexual gift. And I actually spoke to this issue in a 5-part series I did entitled When You or Your Spouse Doesn't Like Sex, beginning in episode 43 of the Power of Purity podcast. So sometimes a person has been profoundly hurt in their life. Maybe they were sexually abused as a child. They had other kind of trauma, maybe sexual trauma in their life. Maybe they were raped at some point. Maybe there have been other issues. Sometimes there's literally physical, organic issues that make sex difficult. And for reasons like this, it's very difficult for a person to participate in sexual activity in the context of their marriage. And maybe they would actually like to have more sex if they could, but for different reasons, it's just that they're in a place where it's profoundly difficult for them. So I just want to acknowledge that. And my encouragement would be that if you are in a place like that, I just encourage you to listen to those 5 episodes when you or your spouse doesn't like sex. And I think the good news is, and we can take encouragement, because there is always hope and healing and redemption possible, regardless of where you are in your life, how difficult your past has been, what your pain and your hurt is, whatever the disorientation is. We can seek counseling, we can seek guidance, we can seek help and wisdom and light and truth that will help us deal with some of these hurts and things from our past that have been prohibiting us from being able to participate in our marriage relationship in a sexual way, even the way that we would like to. So I just want to be sensitive to that. I'm not suggesting that a person who maybe has work to do and issues to work on, that you should be coerced or forced into having sex with your spouse. Obviously not. But I encourage you to seek help, seek counsel, seek wisdom, and deal with those issues so that you can get in a healthier place and then be more available to your spouse, I believe, the way God intends us to be. And you guys know our story, my wife and I. We were 2 profoundly, deeply broken people in the areas of our sexual gift, and the early years of our marriage, because of that, were an absolute mess, and we were very broken. There was a lot of darkness and confusion, and we were totally missing each other sexually. We were not able to connect in a healthy way at all, but we ended up in this therapeutic process, and it lasted over 6 years. And God invited us into our stories, and we began to deal with some root issues and some hurts from the past and some things that had deeply wounded us and made us like unhealthy sexually, made it very difficult for us to function in a healthy way in the context of our marriage. But God's grace is very powerful. His mercy is very powerful. His love is very powerful. His forgiveness, His healing is very possible. You know that one of my favorite scriptures is Psalm 147, verse 3. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. Praise be to God. So Sherry and I began to participate in this therapeutic process, and Psalm 147, verse 3 became true for us. And God began to heal our broken hearts and to bind up our wounds. And we slowly became healthier and healthier than we had ever been. And we were able to turn and face one another and move toward one another. And in turn, our sexual relationship began to get healthier and healthier. So I just want to encourage you that there is hope. there is healing, there is God, there is possibility. And so if you're in the place where it's really, really hard for you to participate sexually with your spouse, I just encourage you to seek that guidance, that counseling, that healing, that redemption that God has for you, so that your marriage and even the sexuality in your marriage can become healthier than it's ever been before. And with that being said, you guys, that brings me to the conclusion of what I've been thinking about. And so I just jumped on the microphone here today. I've just kind of been thinking out loud with you. So I hope that's okay. And I think I've just kind of been wandering around in my thoughts and comments, just kind of thinking out loud. But I pray that there's some substance here, some things to think about that might be helpful and encouraging. So let me conclude this episode by just saying, God bless you guys. I hope you have an awesome day. I hope you have an awesome week. I encourage you to continue to press forward in your walk of purity. And I just pray that when the Lord looks at our lives, He's pleased with what He sees. God bless you. I'll look forward to seeing you in our next episode of the Power of Purity podcast. Have an awesome day.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.